Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Bass Tales. Today we're going to talk all about stock trout and how to easily catch them in your local pond or lake. Here in Massachusetts, they just started stocking trout at the end of September, and they've already put in 2 loads of rainbow trout into a local pond that I like to take my kids fishing to. It has good access to get to these fish, and we went the other day and caught a nice rainbow trout to start off the season right. And this time of year, a lot of people transition to catching trout and move away from largemouth and smallmouth fishing and saltwater fishing. So I thought it was a good time to do an episode. So even if you're not in the Massachusetts area, in a lot of the northern part of the country here, they're starting to stock all over. So I wanted to go over different things about how a stock trout is different than a wild trout, why we have stock trout, and how to catch them easily. But before we do that, let's get into the news. So our first story here isn't the best story, but we could learn something from this. There was an angler at Table Rock Lake that lost up to $6,000 worth of fishing gear. They stole his rods, his tackle out of his boat that was stored at a dock overnight. He came back in the morning to go fishing, saw his cover was removed. He did have a dummy camera there. Maybe they knew it was a dummy camera or just didn't even notice it. So he said he's getting a real camera, so hopefully it won't happen again or get him on film. But my recommendation is, if it was me, I would take your fishing gear out of your boat and bring it home if possible with you, or store it locked in your truck, because a boat docked somewhere is an easy target for a criminal if there's not many people around that area. So it's something we all can learn from that. There's a lot of dishonest people out there, which is really crummy, but I don't want to see this happen to someone else. So just keep that in mind. If you're storing your boat somewhere with all your fishing gear in, it is an easy target. So it might be worth taking your gear with you, even though you might have to lug it back and forth. It's better than losing $1,000 worth of gear. Luckily, I don't carry that much gear with me when I go fishing. I keep it simple with a few rods and a decent sized tackle box with a lot of lures. So I have a bag style tackle box I got away from the plastic ones that will hold some stuff, and I'll just throw it over my shoulder, and it has a carrying strap so I can carry it back easily and hold my couple rods. But if you have a bass boat with tons of gear in it, it is harder to move. I understand that, but you got to make sure wherever you keep your boat that it's not an easy access for a criminal to get in there. So we can all learn from this story, and hopefully that doesn't happen to any of us. Yeah, hopefully this guy will recoup some of his gear. It's a bummer to hear. So our second story here is about a charity called Mile of Hope, and this is their 10th anniversary, and they're based up in upstate New York on Fourth Lake in Inlet, New York. They try to break the Guinness World Record of bringing so many kayakers and canoes to one area, making like an island almost looking thing. The record was previously 3,150 vessels, and it was actually set by this same group the first year they did it in 2014. This year they came a little short. They only got about 2,000 people to come out. It's a little sad that they didn't break it, but it raised a lot of money for this charity that Connie Perry started after her friend passed away from breast cancer. So it goes to good use, going to charities, local hospitals, and stuff like that. But it's a neat to see. If you go online and look at the pictures, it's pretty cool. Like, it's like a floating island of kayaks and canoes. So that was their 10th anniversary. I don't know if they're doing it again, but if they do and you're in that area, it might be worth doing it. So that's a little better story than hearing about someone getting stuff stolen from them. So let's get into our story today, all about stock trout and how to easily catch them in a pond or a lake. So when did stalking trout become a thing? Basically, it happened a long time ago, where you wouldn't even expect. In the 14th century, Dom Pinchon, a French monk, discovered how to artificially fertilize and hatch trout eggs, which you would never think back then that someone would be trying to do that. And when it really got big in the U.S., they started stalking trout in the 1800s. but it wasn't really well recorded, any info from really the 1800s too well. So we don't know too much information about that. And by the 1900s, 38 states had trout stocking programs. And before that, people would just take different species of fish and put them in different waterways, which wasn't always the best. It would affect the native species and some of the plant life and stuff like that. So in the 1960s, they had a research on the negative impacts of fish stocking, leading to the Wilderness Act of 1964. And from this point forward, basically all the stocking is basically controlled by the state governments. It's all funded by your freshwater fishing licenses. So why do they stock trout? The main reason is to give people opportunities to go fishing. They stock mainly in most areas rainbow trout because they're very easy to catch compared to other trout and species of fish. And they don't do much harm to the environment that they're stocked into. They create opportunities for younger anglers to get out and learn how to fish. It also creates community and youth fishing tournaments. They have a lot of those around here in my area. Most popular game fish here in the United States is the largemouth bass, and they start to slow down around this time. They're a warm-watered fish. Metabolism in that fish start to slow down in the cold water, and they ain't as hungry, making them harder to catch. Trout are a cold water fish, so they provide fishing opportunities in these colder months. I still will go out and try to catch bass, but sometimes I just want an easier fish to catch, and I'll go out and trout fish like many others. So that little change from people going saltwater fishing and bass fishing freshwater will switch over to trout, and stocking those trout give you that fishing opportunity. And a lot of areas over the years were decimated, and trout that were native to certain areas aren't native anymore. So that's another reason that trout might be stocked in a certain area, just because there's no access to this fish. And trout were the most popular game fish before largemouth bass basically took over, I think in like the 40s or the 50s, when you started damming up waterways and creating these big reservoirs where bass fishing got way more popular. But before that, trout fishing was probably the number one game fish. It's probably number two now. I don't have the numbers in front of me. I'd have to look at it, but I would say number one game fish is probably largemouth bass, and probably number two is probably a trout. So let's get into the difference between what is a stocked trout and how it is different from a wild trout. And a stocked trout comes from a hatchery. And like I said before, the money is raised from freshwater fishing licenses to run a lot of these state-run hatcheries. There's also, I think, private ones out there. So you could order trout if you wanted, if you had like a private pond on your property. It basically starts with the eggs in the milt. The milt is basically the male sperm of the fish. They take these eggs in this milt from the hatchery's resident fish. After they get the eggs from the fish in the milt, put the eggs in the milt together, the fertilized egg is basically placed in a shallow mesh pan and then submerged into a vat beneath several inches of water. And the water has to be cold and crystal clear and kept around 50 degrees, because that is the ideal temperature for hatching trout. Within a few weeks, their life cycle will begin. Once they develop into fingerlings, which is basically a fingerling is like the size of your finger, they will get transferred into a 500-gallon indoor tank where they'll stay for several months and grow quickly. When they reach around 4 inches, they are ready for the outside pools. And these outside pools are basically these long river-like structures. They're designed to kind of keep it like basically making them feel like they're in a natural river when they're not. So they're these long concrete tanks basically with flowing clear, clean water at about that 50 degree, and it creates that river-like habitat. So they'll remain in these tanks for a while and feed heavily to grow quickly. It takes about 18 months from egg to the fish is the right size of about 14 inches or larger to be able to be released out into our public waterways to be able to catch. So I've took a couple trips 2 different times. One time I just happened to find it randomly when we were camping up New Hampshire. We came across the state of New Hampshire fishery And we stopped in, took the kids there, and it was neat to see all the fish in the tank. When we were there, we saw some bald eagles nesting. It was a nice spot. It was in Warren, New Hampshire. So if you're ever up in that area, check it out. And I remember all the different tanks and stuff. I didn't really know too much about that. But after reading about stocking, I was like, I'm going to take the kids. There's one in Sandwich, Massachusetts. That's not too far from my house. So I took the kids the other day down to check it out. And this article that I read, how trout are grown, I basically got to see it with my own eyes of how it is set up with these not natural structures that make the fish feel like they're living in a river environment. They're these very long concrete, I would say they're like, I don't know, 200 to 300 feet long. They have one for each species of fish. So you got, I believe they keep them separate species. It looks like they have one for brook trout, one for brown trout, one for tiger trout, and one for rainbow trout. So they're all separated and they stay in these little areas. There's like, I would say, if I remember, there's basically different sections. There's one with all the smaller fish, and then there's a section with ones that are slightly bigger, and then the real big fish. You see these in the tank, it makes you really want to fish. Some of these look like they're 6-7 pound rainbow and brown trout in these things, and some big tiger and brook too. But I took the kids there, and trying to feed the big ones, they don't eat as much. It's kind of funny because they must get fed a lot more. But you go over, and if you go there, there's a little gumball machine thing. Bring a couple quarters, and you put it in, and basically you can pull out. They look like little dog food, but it's little mini pellets that you feed the fish, little brown pellets. And you just throw them on top, and they float. And when you throw it, the smaller fish, it's like a swarm of them attacking it. So it's kind of interesting to see that. And then when we were fishing the few of the big ones, they weren't as active. It was neat to see these, 5+ pound rainbow trout and brown trout come up at the pellets too. And basically, so it looks like they have all the little ones in one section, then they have like the mid-size in another section, and the large ones are kept separate. I'm guessing those large ones are the ones that they keep behind, because they got to keep those fish behind, the broadstock as they call it, so they can start the next generation of trout. And like we said, it's 18 months, so they need to have a constant, keep some fish back to create the next batch, because you're going every 6 months restocking every fall and spring. What makes these stock trout different from their wild relatives? It's all in the genetics. This has just been from scientific research over the years, and I kind of relate it to think about dogs, how dogs were bred to do different jobs and stuff like that. But I saw a thing on chickens, producing chickens, some documentary a while back, and there's a special bred chicken. I think it's called like a meat chicken or something that like Tyson and Purdue use and all the chicken companies. But basically they've created this chicken that would grow in like 2 months instead of like 6 months to full size. And basically they don't live as long. Their heart stop like at a certain age because they're, I don't know, the way the genetics. So basically they're just raised. They live for whatever the 2 months, then they're basically, killed and we have dinner. And basically it kind of made me think of this with the trout, because that's kind of what they're doing with these trout. They genetically got them to a point where they're genetically going to grow faster than a wild trout. And they're also going to be slightly more aggressive with eating because they're eating more than a wild trout. So that is in their genetics. That's they're conditioned to be that way. They're different than the wild one. With that, you have a better chance of getting a trophy stock trout over a wild trout because they're genetically made to eat more and get bigger quicker. You'll see certain things like the adipose fin will be clipped, which is the little fin right before the tail. You'll see that sometimes with these trout from different stock situations, or they'll have like bent or rounded fins, and the nose is slightly different than a wild trout, and the behavior is different. So like when they first stock a trout, it's not going to act like a wild trout. They'll never completely act like a wild trout. They're always going to have that need to almost like look up and feed for pellets. They're always not gonna be as afraid of people as a wild trout. So when they first stock these trout, for the first few weeks, they basically stay near the area that they're released in. So that's a good to know for fishing to basically, if you know where they're releasing them at a boat ramp or a certain spot, stick around that area for the first few weeks because that's pretty much where they're going to stick around. And you'll see them like swim basically in schools because they learn that from their habit of the hatchery pools, basically just swimming around in counterclockwise motion with the other fish. So you won't see that with wild trout. So the stock trout basically for those first few weeks will basically stay in schools and swim like real close to like the edges of like the rocks and the shore and stuff because they feel more at home than if they went out deeper because that's what they were used to from their environment when they were hatched. And another thing, some of the stock trout are basically created to be sterile, so they can't spawn. And they won't spawn if they can. They usually won't in lakes or ponds. They only stockfish will spawn maybe in like a river or a stream. You don't really hear about them spawning. I don't know too much about it, but I know some are sterile and that they won't spawn, I guess, in ponds and streams. They need that moving water in like a river or a stream. So that's something that's different than a wild trout. Now that we know how a stock trout is different than a wild trout, let's talk about how to catch them. So we know a few techniques here. We know that they're going to, in the first few weeks, not spread out across the waterway. They're going to stay near that release spot. So that's where you want to target, either by the shore or your boat. Stay in that area for the first few weeks. They're going to be basically actively feeding because they're genetically taught to do that. Another thing is they usually technically are fed mostly in late afternoons. And their most productive time, I would say, I've caught the most myself, is in the late afternoon. They're also pretty active in the early morning at feeding. They prefer overcast days more than sunny days, but I've caught them on sunny days, a lot more on sunny days than probably cloudy days because I just prefer fishing on sunnier days, I guess. I don't do this, but if you're a fly fisherman, they're always looking up because they have that genetic thing in their head to always look for those pellets. So you'll see a lot of people fly fishing for trout, and that's why it works so well for these people because these trout are always looking up. So fly fishing for them is really easy with these stock trout. I want to get more into fly fishing at some point. I did it years ago when I was younger, and I didn't catch any trout because I wasn't fishing a stock trout pond or anywhere that had trout, but I caught, I think, a pickerel, if I remember, on a fly, or it might have been a bass, but it was years ago when I was younger. Basically, they're conditioned to feed and feed a lot. So let me get into basically there's so many different ways to catch trout. Like I said, you can fly fish, you can troll, you can use all sorts of different lures and techniques, just like bass fishing. But I'm going to tell you what I think works best for me in my setup. So if you're just starting out and never did it, I just got into trout fishing maybe like 10 years ago. I didn't do it when I was younger. I basically stuck to bass fishing. These are my two favorite techniques, and this will work good if you're bringing out a child or you're just trying it out for the first time. Basically, you want a spinning rod, like a medium or a light with a fast tip, I prefer, and you want it, 5.5 to 7 feet, and you want to run like a mono fishing line or maybe like a hybrid type fishing line, and you want to keep it around that 6-pound test, 8-pound tops. Trout are way more line shy and sensitive to the line than like a bass is. So my first setup, I would basically go with a slip sinker rig, and I would take I don't know the weight, I didn't have the packaging, but I think it's like a half-ounce egg. The weight doesn't matter too much, but I like the heavier egg, and that's a half-ounce egg sinker. And then I'll put that on the main line, which is usually 6 to 8 pound, and then I'll tie that with the with the egg weight above the barrel swivel, I'll tie onto that, and then I'll tie on about 8 inches roughly of like a 4 pound mono, because you want mono on this setup because you're going to float bait. So you put about 8 inches, if it's a little less, a little more, it ain't going to make too much of a difference. And you want like a 4 pound mono. I usually use like the Trilene XL, but you can use like Stren. You could use probably like kind of a cheaper mono, but I'd go with like a Stren or a Berkeley, something like that they've been making the mono for years, and it's good stuff. I would get about a 10 size hook, 10 to 12 size hook, a small little bait hook. What you do is tie that onto that 4 pound mono, and then I buy these things that a lot of people use the Berkeley, like the dough stuff. I used to use it years ago, actually catching sunfish off a dock when I was a kid. But I like to use the Berkeley Power Bait Magnum Floating Power Eggs. And I prefer the lemon lime. It's like a greenish, yellowish color type egg. And these float really good. And I think they work better than the putty type stuff, the little like Play-Doh stuff that a lot of people are using, or the marshmallows. I just prefer these. Not many people use them, and I think they work pretty well. They're a little hotter. I put on two. What I do is I slide one over the hook and then up the little shaft of the hook a little bit, and then another one on, and I try not to have that hook point sticking out at the end. And they float really well, and they're easy to use, and you don't get the stickiness all over your fingers from like the putty stuff. But you could also use other stuff. Like I said, this is my setup. This is how I fish for them. You want the slip sinker rig with a 1/2 ounce egg sinker above a barrel swivel, which is tied to 4 pound mono, maybe 8 inches long, to a 10 size hook. And then two of those Berkeley Power Bait Magnum Floating Power Eggs in like lemon and lime color. But like I said, the color I don't think matters too much. I like the brighter colors, but you could also, I've used like the yellow or chartreuse ones in the past as well. So that's how I'll set it up. Basically, if I'm fishing with the kids, that's how I let them fish. And then my second setup, basically same type of rod you can use. With the kids, you could use like a spin cast rod, or if you're not good with a spinning rod, spin cast rod. But basically, like I said before, same type of rod. What I use is basically my lighter finesse rod that I use for bass fishing is it's a medium spinning. It's a 6.5 foot Triumph rod by St. Croix with a Kuma reel, and it works pretty good. I think it's a Kuma 20, and I have 6 pound. I use the hybrid Yuzeri that I've kind of fallen in love with. I really like that line. It's like a fluoro mono hybrid line. It works really good. I like it, and that'll be in 6 pound. And that works really good because it sinks a little more than a basic mono. So this is what you can use for your main line, but definitely use the straight mono for the one on your slip sinker. Basically, I use a silver Castmaster mostly in 1/4 ounce. You can go down a little bit in size and go to like an 1/8 ounce or a 1/16 ounce and downsize your rod to a lighter rod. But I usually stick to the 1/4 ounce. I think it works good. It casts really far. And I'll stick to silver pretty much most of the time when the sun's out. If it's a real cloudy day, you could switch over to gold. But also, like the trout pattern works good. I've used the silver and blue. That works really good. So there's a few different colors. But if you're just starting out, pick up like a 1/4 ounce silver and a 1/4 ounce gold, and you'll be good. And basically with the Castmaster, you can just cast that out and basically reel it back at varying speeds. That's about it. It's pretty simple, and you're going to end up nailing some trout. The other day, I took the kids fishing down there for the first time, and that's what I got the trout on. The kids didn't have any luck with the power bait. We seen some of the fish actually swimming along the rocks because they were just stocked on the 29th and the 1st, I think, at the place we were at. And we were down there, I think it was like the 6th. So they were only there a week, but you could still see them schooling up and swimming along the rock line there, the rock wall line there at the place we were fishing. Yeah, I think it was right around 3 o'clock. It was kind of funny. My wife came down to pick up the kids. They had to go to Girl Scouts, and I stayed there to fish a little longer. Right when they got in the car, I got hit by a rainbow trout, and before they left, they got out of the car to help me get a little picture with them, and and release the fish. So they almost left without seeing it. And it was right around that good time, like I said, that late afternoon. It was like 3 o'clock. But I saw fish swimming all around, and they just weren't actively feeding at that time when we got down there. And we got down there about 1 o'clock. So I fished for a little bit before I didn't catch any more. I ended up packing it in. There was another kid that was there, I think on a power bait. He caught one maybe an hour before me, around 2 o'clock. So they weren't like overly eating, but they definitely were active. And in the past, I've used both these techniques. When we've gone camping, a lot of these camping spots will have, and we're camping in the summer too, but these are smaller ponds where these trout are in, and they're pretty active because I've used these same setups and did pretty well camping. Where the kids would caught. One day I took my little one, and this is in July, and they had a little pond, and I think I might have caught one or two on the Castmaster, and she ended up on the power bait setup. I'm talking these power eggs. She ended up catching like 10 that day, and that I think was maybe like the second time she ever went fishing. I think she was like 6 at the time, and she had a hell of a day. And then my other daughter, that's a little older than her, she ended up catching maybe 2 or 3 that day on the power eggs. So it's an easy setup and a good setup for kids to start out is with those power eggs. I like them. I think they work good. And it's an easy setup. You can get everything you need basically at like Walmart, so you're not spending a lot of money. You can get the Castmasters there. You can get basically everything I talked about there except the fishing rod and the hybrid line. I talked to the Uzuri hybrid line that I like. That you'd have to get like right now. I've been finding at Dick's Sporting Goods, and it's real cheap, like $6, where you're getting trilene even at Walmart, but that's around I think like $7 at Walmart. So it's even cheaper than that. I think it performs better, but you definitely want the mono for that setup for that 4 pound with that 8 inch for that little leader off that barrel swivel, because you want it to float. You want these eggs to stay above the ground basically, so you want those floating up so the fish can come by and see it and grab it. Yeah, that's about it. It's a good, easy way to get out there and get some fishing in from the shore. Oh, yeah. So 2 springs ago, it was kind of later in the spring. They stock around here. I think they start stocking late April into, or maybe it's even late March. It might be like late March into April, something like that. They start stocking in the spring. I'd have to look it up. But I remember I was fishing, and we took the boat down there, and it was like early May, I think. And the same pond I'm talking about, where we were fishing from the shore, we went on with the boat though. It's probably like 1.5 miles long. Went on the opposite side, and I had a Castmaster on, and I was nailing rainbow trout over there left and right. They definitely will move around to different spots of the waterway. They'll stay at those first couple weeks. They will stay in that general area where they're released, but then they will spread out across the basically the pond or the lake. That's when you can use your kayak or your boat and go to a different section where everyone might not be fishing, and you might start reeling in some good ones. And also the Castmaster will work well for catching brown trout and brook trout and tiger trout, where the rainbows will go for the power bait. The brown, the brook, and the tiger trout prefer like a moving bait more than like the power bait. But mainly most places, rainbows are the number one stocked fish. Unless you're just targeting like a brown trout, you basically can stick to the power bait for pretty much rainbows, but you'll need to go just like the Castmaster route or some type of moving bait if you're going to target more of the brown trout species. And they're the hottest out of all the stock trout to catch is actually the brown trout. And the brook and the tiger are probably like kind of in the middle between the rainbow. So that's about it. That's what I think is the best way and easiest way is those 2 setups to get you started, to get out there and maybe catch your first rainbow trout or brown trout. And if not, maybe it's a new technique right there that you learned, and it's very simple and easy to use that you maybe haven't tried before to get out there and try fishing. But those are the 2 easy ones to use. There's plenty of other ones to try after you try this. There's all sorts of ways to catch trout just like bass. So get out there, get some fishing in, have some fun, and you guys have a great day. Take care. Thanks for listening.